بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين ولا عدوان إلا على الظالمين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله الملك الحق المبين محمد رسول الله صادق الوعد الأمين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه أجمعين. We're moving through the four Imams, and last time we had the privilege to recall the blessed memory and the eternal legal legacy of al-Imam Malik ibn Anas al-Asbahi, Imam Dar al-Hijrah, the Imam of the abode of the Hijrah. And we saw how he was, as it were, collecting information that was becoming lost, how he was focusing in particular on the necessity to recognize the primacy of the practice of the people of the Prophet's city. Amal Ahl al-Madina, the practice of the people of Medina. So we could consider him to be a kind of fountainhead. What we're moving on to today is one of his most distinguished pupils. And one of the beautiful things about early Islam is that whereas the marginal sects are always having a go at each other, we find that Sunni Islam constitutes a single brotherhood, and the respect between the four Imams indicates that they are not the founders of four rival schools, but rather they have the highest respect for each other as brethren in the great momentous undertaking of capturing and correctly passing on the precious legacy of the Sunnah of the Chosen One, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So they recognize each other as colleagues in this sacred task, and such is their admiration for each other that we find to this day that the people of the Sunnah call themselves al-Sunna wal-Jama'ah. The people of the Sunnah, those who wish to follow the way of the Chosen One, zahiran wa batinan, but they are also people of the Jama'ah, that is to say that we are an inclusive madhab, not exclusive. It is a broad interpretation of Islam. Al-Mahajjat al-Bayda, which the Holy Prophet ﷺ indicated that he had brought, is a broad way as well as a straight way, and this is how our Sunni scholars have always understood it. And we will certainly see this as we move through the story of the four Imams and see the honor which they did to each other without exception. And then the story of their disciples as their schools developed not just specific positions with regard to each other, but also internal differences. Within the Shafi'i madhab, there's at least two significant points of view and many sub-points of view, and so it is with the other madhahib. And this is the nature of the Islam, of the people of the Sunnah and the Jama'ah. So the best known pupil of Imam Malik, although he had so many, and strategically located in Medina, where so many people were passing through to make ziyarah of the Chosen One, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or on their way to Hajj, or both, enabled his madhab to spread very quickly. So within a fairly short space of time, it acquires followers in Iraq, in Andalusia, and so forth. And Imam al-Shafi'i is also well placed, as we will see. But whereas Imam Malik stays in one place and the world comes to him, Imam Shafi'i, although based for much of his early career in the city of Mecca, is very much the traveller, the globetrotter, and he acquires his fiqh from all of the great centres of early Islamic law. Now, Imam Shafi'i was born almost certainly in the town of Gaza in Palestine. According to some accounts, it was in the nearby city of Asqalan, but the majority of the historians say that it was in the city of Gaza. Everybody agrees on his date of birth, the year 150, which incidentally is the year in which Imam Abu Hanifa passes away. Some say it's on the same night, but that may just be an embellishment, but certainly in the same year. And his nasab, his lineage, is really important. Because he has a qaraba, he has a kinship to the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So his lineage is Muhammad ibn Idris, ibn al-Abbas, ibn Uthman, ibn Shafi', ibn al-Sa'ib, ibn Ubaid, ibn Abd Yazid, ibn Hashim, ibn al-Muttalib, ibn Abd Manaf. So as we go higher up, we find familiar names. Muttalib, of course, al-Muttalib was the one who fostered Abdul Muttalib ibn Hashim, who was the grandfather of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he's kind of on the cousin's side, and this became important to him. And these Muttalibi descendants of al-Hashim are included in the hadith by the Holy Prophet himself in the category of Dhawil Qurba, and the famous verse that says وَلِذِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينَ وَابْنِ السَّبِيلِ, that in distributing the spoils of war from the campaign of Khaybar, the Holy Prophet ﷺ includes the descendants of al-Muttalib amongst the Dhawil Qurba, and therefore implicitly the family that produces Imam al-Shafi'i. So the Holy Prophet says, إِنَّهُمْ لَمْ يُفَارِقُونَ فِي جَاهِلِيَّةٍ وَلَا إِسْلَامٍ إِنَّمَا بَنُو هاشم وَبَنُو الْمُطَّلِبِ شَيْءٌ واحد ثُمَّ شَبَّكَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمْ يَدَيْهِ, which means they never abandoned us in the Jahiliyyah or in Islam. The Banu Hashim and the Banu Muttalib are one thing. And then he brought his hands together like that, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is an indication of the nobility and the blessedness of the lineage of our Imam. That's on his father's side. On his mother's side, he was from the tribe of Azd. So she's not from Quraysh. Sometimes you'll find some hardline Shafi'is claiming that she was a descendant of Imam al-Hasan. Some have been led astray by that, but in fact there's no solid evidence for it. Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi, although himself a Shafi'i and a great lover of Imam al-Shafi'i, has discounted that supposition. So he's born in Gaza and in the year 150. And his family is poor. Despite this very aristocratic background, he's poor, and his family move around in kind of Yemeni immigrant districts, shanty towns almost, of those towns of coastal Palestine. They're very unsettled. Shortly after he's born, his father dies, and his mother then takes him away to Mecca. So he only spends maybe 2 years in Palestine, and then he goes to the city of Mecca. The reason seems to have been that his mother, very conscious of the nobility of his lineage, thought that perhaps it would be lost, and that if he was amongst Quraysh in Mecca, that would ensure that the memory of his lineage would not be lost. So we have Imam Shafi'i himself saying, وَلِدْتُ بِغَزَّةَ سَنَةَ خَمْسِينَ وَمِئَةٍ وَحُمِلْتُ إِلَى مَكَّةَ وَأَنَا بْنُ سَنَتَيْنِ. I was born in Gaza in the year 150, and I was carried off to Mecca when I was only 2 years old. And this combination is important, that he has the most noble lineage, but he's in an extremely marginal economic situation. And some of the scholars have said that is one of the clues to understanding the nature of his fiqh. On the one hand, he has a tremendously honourable and noble vision of what human beings can be. He expects a lot of human beings, and particularly expecting a lot of the mind, because it's a very rational madhab. He recognises that mind and logic are really what distinguish us as human beings from the animals. But at the same time, it's also a very practical madhab, and there is a lot in it to do with mercy, and to do with recognizing, particularly in the way the Shafi'is give authority to judges, recognizing the reality of people's lives. And many of the early fuqaha emphasized this. So Imam al-Shafi'i grows up in this rather poor environment, but with this noble lineage. And quite often you find some of the best people in the Islamic world are like that. They're noble, that they recognize that they are called to emulate the nobility of their ancestors, but they're not spoiled by wealth, which is the lot of the majority of people who have been given wealth. And quite often you'll find some of the poor Ahl al-Bayt are some of the best people that you'll ever find. I was once traveling with my family in central Bosnia, and we were pointed to a little village on top of a mountain near Vojnica in central Bosnia. Everybody there is Ahl al-Bayt. The tradition is only the Ahlul Bayt can actually live in that village. The whole village is full of fiqh and full of dhikr and khalwa. Very beautiful place, but really poor. Really very poor people. And that's an example of the kind of environment that can produce great human beings. There's a purity and a sense of vocation there. Some of the other ulama do the same thing. Imam al-Shaybani, for instance, who we'll see coming to play an important role in Imam al-Shafi'i's later career, كان يختلف إلى الصباغين. He used to spend a lot of time with the dyers, and that, if you've been to a city like Fez in Morocco or elsewhere, you'll know it's a kind of stinky, unpleasant profession because of the kind of materials that are used in order to tan leather and to dye fabrics. فكان يذهب إلى الصباغين ويسأل عن معاملاتهم. He used to spend time with these people and ask them, get to know them and ask about their situation, how their life was, what their issues were, what was going on amongst them, in order to know the people. And also to know their ada, because one of the things that a judge does in a Sharia court is to know what is customary amongst the people, what is a customary expectation. That's part of the implementation of justice. And unfortunately, many scholars nowadays tend to neglect this. They can sit in five-star hotels at fiqh conferences deciding what should be the situation of abortion law, whatever it might be, but without having enough actual knowledge of the situation of particularly the weaker, the destitute, the more desperate, people who need fatwas quite urgently. It's very theoretical. But the early Muslims and the scholars of the Salaf very much rejected that and insisted that they really knew every level of their society, and particularly that the Sharia was there to defend the poor. So he's in the city of Mecca and he's an orphan. His mother directs him to the circles of knowledge. By the age of 7, we're told, by Imam al-Bayhaqi, he had memorized the Quran. By the age of 10, it seems that he had memorized at least one of the versions of the Muwatta of Imam Malik. And he used to love hadith. كان حريصا عليه يستمع إلى المحدثين فيحفظ الحديث بالسمع ثم يكتب على الخزف أحيانا وعلى الجلود أخرى. He used to love hadith and would go to the circles of the muhaddithin and memorize hadith just from hearing it. He couldn't afford books or to study in any other way. He just heard and heard and heard until he memorized the hadith. And then, when he had to write things, he would write the hadith on pieces of broken pottery or on old pieces of leather or parchment. And it said that because he was poor, he couldn't afford to buy writing materials. So he used to hang around at the diwan of the governor of the city of Mecca, asking for any old pieces of parchment or scrap. This is the days before paper, of course, but the things people used to write on, so that he could then write the hadith. So there are these two aspects of his childhood learning: Quran and hadith. Particularly the Muwatta of Malik was the big thing at the time. And then a third thing, which also becomes important, قَدْ اتَّجَهَ إِلَى التَّفَصُّحِ فِي الْعَرَبِيَّةِ. He had a strong inclination to speaking really classical, refined Arabic. وَقَدْ خَرَجَ فِي سَبِيلِ هَذَا إِلَى الْبَادِيَةِ وَلَزِمَ هُذَيْلًا. And for the sake of this, he went out to the desert and sought out and kept the company of the tribe of Hudayl. Why Hudayl amongst all the hundreds of Arabic tribes? Because they were the ones with the reputation for the purest and the most chaste Arabic. And so he spent time with them, according to some scholars, 10 years in the desert with Hudayl. And he himself said afterwards, أَتَعَلَّمُ كَلَامَهَا وَأَخُذُ طَبْعَهَا. I would learn their speech and take their temperament, their nature. وَكَانَتْ أَفْصَحَ الْعَرَبِ. And they were the most eloquent of the Arabs. أَرْحَلُ بِرَحِيلِهِمْ وَأَنْزِلُ بِنُزُولِهِمْ. I would ride when they rode and descend from the camels when they descended. وَلَمَّا رَجَعْتُ إِلَى مَكَّةَ جَعَلْتُ أُنْشِدُ الْأَشْعَارِ. And when I returned to Mecca, I started to produce poetry. And of all of the great ulama of early Islam, Imam al-Shafi'i is the one whose poetry is the most respected. And you can travel around in the Arab world today and you'll find the Diwan of Imam al-Shafi'i, his collection of poems, really almost a bestseller, hugely popular and beautiful, not just because of the piety which it evinces, but because of the refinement, the delicacy of his speech. So there's a number of stories about the beauty of his Arabic, which goes on to help him to promote his ideas when he starts to write and to speak, particularly in the very competitive academic environment of Baghdad. The Iraqis are big on Arabic vocabulary and Arabic grammar. Al-Asma'i, who is the tutor of the sons of Harun al-Rashid and one of the great early grammarians of Basra, and kind of encyclopedic individual, the first person to write books on animals in Islam, for instance, a zoologist. He said, صححت أشعار هذيل على فتى من قريش يقال له Muhammad ibn Idris. When I was editing and correcting and checking out the poetry of Hudayl, I did it with the help of a young man from Quraysh whose name was Muhammad bin Idris. Of course, this was Imam al-Shafi'i. And quite often, later in life, people will see that in his majlis in the mosque when he was teaching his fiqh, the Bedouin would turn up. And normally the Bedouin have nothing to do with ilm. They just come to buy salt and they sell cheese and then they go back to their wilderness. But they would come to the mosque and listen to Imam al-Shafi'i talking about quite esoteric things. And one student asked them, you people have no interest in learning ilm, so why do you come to sit with us? فقال, and he said, we've come to hear al-Shafi'i's Arabic. They didn't know what he was about really, but the beauty of his speech would attract these desert people for whom beautiful Arabic was the most important thing. So according to Ibn Kathir, great Shafi'i historian, he spends 10 years in the desert, and there, as well as perfecting his speech, he learns horse riding and also learns archery, and he becomes famous for rimaya, for archery. So later on in life, he says this, كانت همتي في شيئين. My focus, my love, my preoccupation was on two things, في الرمي وفي العلم, in archery and knowledge. فصرت في الرمي بحيث أصيب من 10. I was so good at archery that I would hit the target 10 times out of 10. فسكت عن العلم. But then he wouldn't talk about his scholarship. He's humble. He's not going to say that he's a great scholar. فقالوا بعض الحاضرين, and one of those who were present said, أنت والله في العلم أكثر منك في الرمي. And he said, by Allah, you are more accurate in your scholarship than you are in archery. So he's a teenager. He's in the city of Mecca. Most of the teaching at the time is happening around the Kaaba in great circles of hadith and fiqh. And he studies in particular under somebody called Muslim bin Khalid al-Zanji, apparently an African scholar, who authorizes him when he's reached the age of 15 to give fatwas. Of course, in Islam, to have an opinion that you give publicly, you have to be authorized to do that. You can't just read a lot of books about fiqh and then start telling people what the correct judgment might be, which is often the catastrophe that we see in internet chat rooms these days. But the correct way of the Salaf is only to speak and to proclaim an opinion if you've been authorized to do so. Otherwise, you just listen. You might say, Sheikh so-and-so says this, Sheikh so-and-so says that, but to give your own fatwa, you have to be authorized. So at the age of 15, Imam al-Shafi'i is being authorized to give fatwa in the shadow of the Kaaba itself. But that wasn't enough. You might think to give fatwa is about as far as it can go, but he wanted more. The Muwatta was the book that everybody was preoccupied with in Mecca at the time. Probably the most famous book in the Islamic world at the time, other than the Quran itself. And of course, he wanted this, so he couldn't afford it, but he borrows a copy, and as we've said, he memorizes it when really he's still a child. And then he manages to travel to Medina. He takes his mother's permission, and he gets a letter of recommendation from the governor of the city of Mecca, and he travels to Medina in order to see the great Imam. And sometimes this is called Hijrat al-Shafi'i, the hijrah or the migration of Shafi'i, which some take to be his migration from hadith to fiqh. Of course, they're not alternatives, but the primary focus in Mecca had been the memorizing, the acquisition of Quran and hadith. After he moves to study with Imam Malik in Medina, fiqh becomes the thing for which he's most famous. He's a great muhaddith, but we remember him today, as we do all of the four imams, as a faqih, as a master of sacred law. وَكَانَتْ لِمَالِكٍ فِرَاسَةٍ. Malik had a firasa, that is to say, this is the quality of the ones who are pure-hearted, of discerning gifts in people just by looking at them and observing intuitively there states كانت له فراسة فقال له, and he said to him, يا محمد اتق الله واجتنب المعاصي. So when he sees him, he says, O Muhammad, fear Allah and avoid disobedience to him. فإنه سيكون لك شأن من الشأن, because you will have a great future. إن الله قد ألقى على قلبك نورا. Allah has cast light upon your heart. فلا تطفئه بالمعصية. So do not put out that light with sin. And then he told him to come the next day. So it was a blessed introduction. So many people wanted to study with Imam Malik, and now he was being welcomed. قال, and then Shafi'i says, فغدوت عليه. The next morning I went to see him. وابتدأت أن أقرأه ظاهرا والكتاب في يدي. And then I started off by reading with the book in my hand. Now, of course, the Muwatta he already knows, but out of humility, he's holding the book in his hands. فكلما تهيبت مالكا وأردت أن أقطع. Every time I was so overawed by the presence of Malik and wanted to fall silent, أعجبه حسن قراءتي. I found that he loved the way in which I was reading so much, والإعراب, and the way in which I was inflecting the ends of the words. فيقول يا فتى زد, and he would say, young man, read some more. حتى قرأت عليه في أيام يسيرة, until I actually finished reading the book with him in just a few days. And this connection becomes the defining teacher-pupil relationship of his life. And some would say that he was always a Maliki, that his orientation is just a particular finessing of certain possibilities that he'd already found amongst Imam Malik. He would always certainly consider Malik's to be the default position. One would assume the correctness always of the Maliki position unless there was some reason to move beyond it. So often in his writings he would say something like, هذا قول الأستاذ. You find this if you read his books. هذا قول الأستاذ. In other words, this is the fatwa, the view of the teacher, meaning Imam Malik. So he takes his ijazah from him, and then he studies various masail of fiqh with him until in the year 179, as we saw last time, Imam Malik passes on to Allah's mercy. But already Imam Shafi'i has begun his program of traveling. And we have a reasonably good map of where he went, and in each of these places he acquired a dimension of the geographical spread of the fiqh that had happened really with the conquest of the Sahaba, and all of these different legal insights help him in slotting together the theory that eventually becomes the great Shafi'i theory of Islamic jurisprudence. Before going on his journeys, he would travel first to Mecca to ask his mother's advice and to ask permission to travel. This is important in Islam. You have to think his she's just a woman from the tribe of Azd, but he always goes to consult with her. Just because a woman is not a great scholar doesn't mean that the scholar does not have heavy, onerous responsibilities towards her, and does not mean that she can't have all kinds of wisdom and guidance and knowledge of the son or the daughter, which is always valuable, irrespective of the difference in educational levels. The governor of Najran, which is the northernmost city in the Yemen, comes to Medina, and he'd heard of a Shafi'i and employs him. So he goes back to Najran with the governor, having borrowed money apparently for the journey. And as a judge, he becomes one of those awkward individuals, and we saw this in the case of Sahnun last time. Judge really the center of the commercial as well as the legal and social life of the community, but refusing to allow flattery, refusing to accept special pleading, and refusing to accept bribes of any kind. So he very soon makes enemies, particularly since the governor, the Abbasid governor of the region, is known as Zalum, is really unjust, and he's always trying to get the judge to bend to his wishes. And not only does Shafi'i refuse to do this, but he actually criticizes him publicly. The governor's outraged and wants to get rid of him. And the way he does this is to invent charges against Imam Shafi'i to the effect that he was implicit in some Shi'i hostility to the Abbasid state. And the Abbasids were pretty brutal when it came to any kind of dissent. They would just stamp on them on mere suspicion of planning a revolution. So the governor writes to the Khalifa in Baghdad, claiming that Shafi'i is from the Shia. And of course the fact that he has this Hashimi lineage makes that perhaps a little bit less far-fetched. And indeed we do find in Imam Shafi'i's Diwan all kinds of expressions of love for the Ahlul Bayt. So for instance he says, آل النبي ذريعتي وهم إليه وسيلتي أرجو بهم أعطى غدا بيد اليمين صحيفتي. The family of the Prophet are my means, and they are my method of coming to him. By them I hope that tomorrow I will be given my sahifa, my book of record, in my right hand. So this is like invoking them as a means to the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A very powerful statement. So he does have this love, but of course that's a normal Sunni love for the Ahlul Bayt. There's no political implication to that, nor any sense that the Imams are possessed of some infallible knowledge of past, present and future. There's nothing like that. But still, a governor writing about a relatively unknown person from the Muttalibi Hashimi lineage in a Yemeni city, writing to the Khalifa, that's a dangerous letter. And the governor does write of Shafi'i, يَعْمَلُ بِلِسَانِهِ مَا لَا يَقْدِرُ عَلَيْهِ الْمُقَاتِلُ بِسَيْفِهِ. With his tongue, he achieves that which a warrior couldn't achieve with his sword. This is what they're worried about. They're worried about people preaching in a way that's subversive of the Abbasid political order. So he gets the word that he has to go to Baghdad. He's more or less under arrest with 8 other revolutionaries. He's taken off to the city of Baghdad to appear before the Khalifa. One after the other 8 are, the historians tell us, executed. Imam Shafi'i, when he gets his turn in front of the Khalifa, defends himself in his beautiful Arabic and also is spoken for by one of the great, really at the time the greatest Sunni faqih of the caliphal capital, which is Imam Muhammad ibn al-Shaybani, one of the 2 great students of Imam Abu Hanifa. Al-Shaybani is there for this kind of court hearing at the caliphal palace, and looking at him and listening to him could immediately tell that here was a serious scholar. The scholars have an ability of recognizing authenticity amongst themselves, and immediately Shaybani could see that here was an important person. So he mentioned this to the Khalifa, and Harun al-Rashid says, "Khutu ilayk, take him to you. We'll investigate him later, but for the moment he can stay with you and be with your students." This is in the year 184, so Imam Shafi'i at this time is 34. Now, in Baghdad, Shafi'i is in a kind of wonderland, like a kid in a sweet shop. There's the world's biggest city, the great scholars are there, libraries, it's an amazing place. It's the center of everything, different from Najran. And he has the chance to learn the fiqh of Iraq. As we said last time, there's 2 great schools of fiqh amongst the early Muslims at this time. There's the fiqh of the Hijaz. Imam Malik is the great master of that, and there's the fiqh of Iraq, and of course Abu Hanifa, who has died by this time, is the master of the fiqh of Iraq. In the Hijazi tradition, it's very traditionalistic and in terms of what has been transmitted. In the Iraqi tradition, it's much more rationalistic. So this makes the law there different, not just in its content, but also in the legal philosophy which is generating it. And this is one of those pieces of the jigsaw which, as we indicated earlier, fit together in the mature Shafi'i and produce his truly momentous works. So he spends a lot of time with Imam Shaybani. He said that he had a whole camel load of his books, which Imam Shaybani had him read to him and had authorized him to teach. In fact, Shaybani honors him so much that he considers Shafi'i to be his own teacher. It's not really a master-pupil relationship. They're like equals, even though Shafi'i is quite a bit younger. But still, he always considers himself in this Iraqi exile to be a Hijazi in fiqh. That's his key orientation. He has such respect for Shaybani that he will not dispute with him in public. He won't ever engage in some kind of oppositional discourse about a legal issue with Imam Shaybani in front of others in case his teacher and his host is defeated. It would be discourteous. But he would always defend Malik's positions with Shaybani's students. He was essentially the Maliki in exile. Then he travels back to Mecca. He has a huge load of Iraqi books. And in Mecca, he starts to teach in the Haram. And here, of course, he gets to meet all of the scholars who ever come for Hajj, including Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal. This is the context in which they have their encounters. And it's really with this return to Mecca that we find the new Shafi'i emerging. He's still a Hijazi, essentially, in his orientation and in his love of naql, of the transmitted material. In fact, his zeal for the hadith is very strong. But the aql, the use of the intellect, sorting things out, reasoning things out, using systematic scholarly techniques to get to the heart of the matter, which is the key to the Iraqi method, particularly linked to a mastery of Arabic language and therefore to logic, which is the great Iraqi speciality, starts to launch Shafi'i on his very extraordinary meteoric career as a jurisprudent. Really, you could say that it's here that the crucible of the Shafi'i vision is formed. A love for the naql, for the transmitted material, Quran and Hadith, which is the Hijazi legacy. Added to that, the Iraqi love of sorting through that material, which is huge material, of course, maybe 1 million hadiths or more, using rational techniques. And also the third ingredient, which is very characteristic of Imam Shafi'i, a love of the Arabic language and of its precise usage. So this stint in Mecca lasts for about 9 years. And here he starts to reflect on the condition of the Ummah. Let's take a few minutes here to imagine what the world must have looked like. The Sahaba and the Tabi'een have spread out to conquer the world, really, everywhere that's significant. They're at the gates of France and they're at the gates of China. Everywhere is theirs. Only Byzantium has managed just to resist them, despite various sieges that the Sahaba undertook of Istanbul. And of course, some of them have their tombs there. These were extraordinarily far-sighted, visionary, ambitious people. They each took with them their own fiqh. And the Sahaba had different orientations in fiqh. Ibn Abbas was not the same as Ibn Mas'ud, for instance. Each of the 4 khulafa had his own distinctive way of understanding and interpreting the fiqh, depending on which hadith they happened to have heard from the Holy Prophet ﷺ. Their own personality, their own temperament, all kinds of variables meant that the great scholars amongst the Sahaba, as they settled in different places, as it were, transformed the environment in those places according to the way in which their own souls had acquired and reflected the prophetic way. And hence we have the phenomenon of ikhtilaf, a difference of opinion, which by this time, because they'd settled in different places, was regionalized. That's why we speak of the school of Iraq and the school of Hijaz. There's also a school of Syria, which is significant. Imam al-Awza'i is there. An incipient Egyptian school, sometimes associated with Malik's pupil, al-Layth bin Sa'd, and so on. And it is about the Sahaba, but the Sahaba usually, an ijma' amongst them can't be recognized. You can't detect it because there just isn't enough information. Now, the scholars all agree that if the Sahaba do have an ijma', if they agree on a mas'ala, on a hukm, on a ruling, that constitutes a binding proof in the Sharia. So, for instance, we do have an ijma' that is reliably reported on the question of What happens when somebody dies and their grandmother is still alive, and a grandmother's share is not specified in the Quran as part of the inheritance, but we do have a report that the Sahaba agreed that her share should be 1/6, and so that goes into the Sharia as it stands, and it's in the Madahib. Individual fatwas from Sahabas are also constitute a proof. Just about everybody agrees on that. Imam al-Shawkani and one or two, quite a few modern reformers will doubt the authority of the fatwas of Sahaba, but generally the four orthodox madhabs accept this. But of course the fatwas are sometimes different. The ikhtilaf of the Ummah begins with the blessed age of the Sahaba. It is part of the legacy and the nature of the Salaf, and it's implicit really in the Holy Prophet's praise of the Sahaba. He says things like "Ashabi kan nujum, bi ayyihim iqtadaytum ihtadaytum." My companions are like the stars. Whichever of them you follow, you will be rightly guided. Which implies really that they will take different opinions, but the difference of their opinion, according to this hadith, constitutes legitimate guidance. So the Holy Prophet himself says you can have different fatwas, different views on questions of fiqh, and they constitute right guidance. But by this time, these incipient divisions had become pretty enormous, and the danger was that the coherence of the fiqh was going to be lost. This is the age of Tadween. Everybody is sitting and writing down hadiths. Imam Malik has sort of set the pace with his Muwatta, but other people are also working on major hadith collections, Abu Dawood, Nasir, Tirmidhi, and so forth. A huge amount of work is being done just putting them together, but exactly what you do with them in terms of transforming hadith into fiqh was much more complicated. Nobody had really thought about it in much detail. And so the collections of hadith ran the risk of simply expanding these differences. And although ikhtilaf, differences of opinion in itself, is not a problem, there obviously have to be limits. For the coherence of the divine law, there has to be a certain overarching consistency. Otherwise, you don't have a legal tradition any longer. You have two divisions that are too profound. Very often you find Shafi'i puzzling over a Hijazi fatwa that differs from an Iraqi fatwa. And he comes to recognize that there actually has to be a careful, systematic method for doing this. Otherwise, there will be no agreement. And that is essentially the realization that triggers what makes him a Shafi'i, which is his founding of the discipline of usul al-fiqh. The phrase usul al-fiqh wasn't really known in his time, although the Shafi'is become really the great masters of usul al-fiqh. Jurisprudence, the methods by which the religion is found in the Quran and the Hadith and secondary sources like qiyas, ijma' and so forth. Usul al-fiqh, the roots of the law. Furu' al-fiqh, the branches of the law are the individual things to do with what you wear, how you pray, and so forth. The actual rulings, positive law, are the furu', the branches. The usul, the roots, are the ways in which those rulings are found in the sources. And of course, it's going to be a sophisticated and a difficult discipline. But we have really Imam al-Shafi'i to thank for this. In the year 195, with this realization that there's a potential crisis, if people just take what they think is the hadith, or if they take what they think is a rational interpretation, or the practice of the people of Medina, or whatever, there's going to be an unraveling of the Sharia. With this thought in his mind, in the year 195, he goes to Baghdad for his second visit. And here he finds a willing audience for his expounding of a new fiqh, a fiqh that has a strongly theoretical dimension. We cannot just in a kind of ad hoc way take a ruling here, take a hadith there, and that becomes our fiqh. Instead, there has to be a legal philosophy that determines the way in which we minimize the possibility of error in our determining of correct Islamic practice. So he doesn't spend so much time now discussing individual masail. He doesn't give fatwas very much when he's in Iraq. Instead, he's trying to thrash out this theory, testing it with the great scholars. And this is where he writes his great work, al-Risala. Risala just means a letter or an epistle, a treatise. The story of its compilation is that many who are in this very intellectually demanding circle in his mosque in Baghdad, who are listening to his views on how you do an analogy, what constitutes an abrogating verse, how you determine the public interest, all of these theoretical things, which he's doing by thinking aloud, and then it becomes accumulating into really a legal vision. People want him to write it down. So according to Fakhruddin al-Razi, of course a later Shafi'i, but somebody who writes very interestingly about the foundation of his madhab, روي أن عبد الرحمن ابن مهدي التمس من الشافعي وهو شاب أن يضع له كتابا يذكر فيه شرائط الاستدلال بالقرآن والسنة والإجماع والقياس وبيان الناسخ والمنسوخ ومراتب العموم والخصوص. Abd al-Rahman ibn Mahdi, great scholar of Iraq, sought or petitioned Imam al-Shafi'i while he was still a young man. He is still a young man at this time. He's a prodigy. And يَضَعَ لَهُ كِتَابًا, to write for him a book in which he would mention the conditions for the correct deduction of rulings from the Quran, from the Sunnah, from Ijma', from Qiyas, and the clarification of what constitutes an abrogating scriptural text and what constitutes a text that can be considered to be abrogated, and the different degrees of al-umum wal-khusus, that is to say, a text that might seem to be complete or to have a universal application, but actually, whereas there are other texts which have only a specific application, which are for certain people, for certain genders, for certain times, or whatever, which is one of the things that Imam Shafi'i is particularly good at indicating, whether a proof text in the Quran and the Hadith is actually for everybody for all time, or for a particular context, or has to be interpreted in a particular way. It's called takhsis, specification of a text that seems to be universal. So he's asking him to do this. Please, these are great lectures, but let's have it as a manifesto. فوضع الشافعي رضي الله عنه كتاب الرسالة. So Imam al-Shafi'i رضي الله عنه writes the book of al-Risala, the treatise. وبعثها إليه, and sends a copy to him. فلما قرأها عبد الرحمن بن مهدي قال, and when Abd al-Rahman read it, he said, ما أظن أن الله عز وجل خلق مثل هذا الرجل. I never thought that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created somebody the likes of this man. Nobody had seen a book like this before. It's one of the great innovative moments in the intellectual history of the religion. A theory, and it really is, you can see, a very sophisticated, comprehensive theory. Later generations of Shafi'i and then other fuqaha elaborate upon it, but essentially it is Shafi'i's great creation. And this is what's known as the first Risala, the first version, the first edition, if you like, which he writes in Baghdad. And when he moves later on to Egypt, he writes the second updated version, which is the one that exists in Majid Khadouri's English translation, for instance. So in Iraq, he's working very hard to spread this method, not as academics do nowadays in order to get promotion or to earn brownie points in a research assessment exercise, but because he believes that this is the way to ensure a correct and consistent and responsible interpretation which will give people the Sunnah without distortion. And he does this by writing this little book, by training jurists, and his disciples become hugely influential, as we'll see, and by generally giving people the sense that we have the practice of the law, but we don't have a theory yet, and it is time for theory. And Iraq, the land of rationality, using one's mind, is, of course, the place to do it. But then, perhaps surprisingly, having apparently found his natural home, in the year 199, when he's 49, he moves to Egypt. And the reason why he does this, although he doesn't tell us is fairly clear. In the year 198, the Khalifa was al-Ma'mun. The al-Ma'mun is famous for having a bee in his bonnet about some of the Mu'tazili ideas. Whether he was quite a Mu'tazili himself, something that's a little hard to determine, but certainly he favoured them. And one of the odd Mu'tazilite doctrines, which was the creation of the Qur'an, that there was a time when Allah didn't know the Qur'an and then he made it, and it's like any other book. There was a time when there was not Kalamullah. The Mu'tazilite idea, he actually imposed by force. And this is the sad episode in early Islamic history known as the Mihna, the Inquisition. Scholars could only continue in their teaching and in their preaching and in their jobs and with their salaries if they subscribed to this idea that al-Qur'an, Kalamullah, al-Makhluq. And this was even written above the gates of the mosques. So implicitly people who went to worship in the mosques were, as it were, accepting this idea. And the center for this is Egypt, and the place to go if you're not on signal with this notion is Egypt. Because the governor of Egypt doesn't really buy this new idea of the createdness of the Quran. We're told even that al-Ma'mun wants to co-opt Shafi'i and offers him a huge salary if he'll become his chief judge of Baghdad, but Shafi'i instead decides to migrate. He writes some poetry about this. قد أصبحت نفسي تتوق إلى مصر ومن دونها قطع المهامة والقفر فوالله ما أدري أللفوز والغنى أساق إليها أم أساق إلى القبر. My soul has started to desire the land of Egypt, even though there are deserts and wildernesses that separate me from it. For by Allah, I don't know whether I am being driven to it for success and financial independence, or whether I am being driven to it because that is where my grave shall be. He didn't know. As it turned out, it was all of those things. He achieved financial independence, and he was hugely successful as a jurist, and that, of course, is where his tomb is. And he dies on the last night of Rajab in the year 204 at the age of 54. That's a sketch of his biodata. Let's look now in a little more detail at this new fiqh, which is really dedicated his enormously energetic life to elaborating. It's the fiqh that was germinating in his mind during his second stay in Mecca, and which he expounded in his second stay in Iraq. Now, the first thing to note is that the thing that had troubled Imam Shafi'i and that impelled him to think so hard that he could create, almost from nothing, a new legal theory, what had troubled him was the chaos of judgments that were taking place. A very decentered legal system, and one in which methods were random. A hadith could be used in one place, not in another place. People could use local precedent in one place. In Syria, the school of Syria was particularly relaxed about basically just favouring public interest or what a particular Umayyad caliph might have done. In Medina, it was the practice of the people of Medina. And there was a real danger, he thought, that the credibility of the Sharia as the will of God could be threatened, and he really wanted to tighten things up. But what's amazing about it, and this is where his spiritual depth becomes clear, is that it's not an angry book. The Risala is not really having a go at anybody. He doesn't ever say anything rude about Malik or Abu Hanifa or anybody, really. In its nature, it's really a challenge to the way things were. But in its ironic language, in its determination just to get to the point, it's a very detached and respectful text. Of course, there's some positions out there in this complex legal landscape that he can't buy into. And there's two extremes which he will not accept. And one extreme is the Rafidi Shi'i opinion, which is that reliable, infallible knowledge only comes through a succession of infallible imams. And the other is that we just take the hadith. And both of those he regards as unacceptable. The Kharijites in particular, with a particularly literalistic interpretation of the Quran and the hadith. Whatever the Quran seems to say to an uneducated person, that is absolutely the correct interpretation, and there can be no elaboration or comparison with other texts or any sort of deeper understanding. That was a view that had caused catastrophe, narrow-mindedness. My interpretation of the literal sense of the text is the only one that's correct, and therefore I can even fight people, isti'rad, assassinate people who take a different view of the meaning of the Quran or Sunnah. Imam Shafi'i is not going to try to tolerate that or integrate it because it's a catastrophe. Sometimes some people on the hard edge of the Hanbali school could seem to take that view as well. And Imam Shafi'i had occasionally had brushes with some of these in Baghdad, where they insisted on keeping themselves to themselves. They lived in their own district, they had their own imams and so forth. And sometimes the hardliners amongst them would attack people who followed scholars with whom they disagreed. They were arch literalists. So you might say that the Risala is a text of the Ahl al-Sunna wal Jama'ah, the text of the middle way. The Sunnah as interpreted is interpreted by the generality of the scholars, not those who believe in some kind of divine right of scholarly kings on the one side, or those who believe in the fierce literal application of hadiths on the other. This is al-Mahajjat al-Bayda, the beautiful broad white path of Sunni Islam. So implicitly, it's a criticism of the way things are legally, but as I mentioned, it's not polemical. And we find tremendous respect, for instance, in the way he treats Malik and his fatwas, even though he quite often goes against the fatwas of Malik. He doesn't say ever that Malik is wrong. Now, he is worried because he is a man of the naql, he's a man of the hadith in particular, that some Malikis in some places have got the wrong end of the Maliki stick and are thinking that there is something called Sunnah and something called the practice of the people of Medina, and it's the latter that we think is authoritative. And that, of course, can't possibly be right. And that's a view that some of the Malikis in rather remote places like Spain were developing. Imam Shafi'i was concerned by this. And so the practice of the city of Medina becomes much less significant as a source of authority for the Maliki view. And he does acquire the name for the Shafi'i view, and he does acquire the name of Nasir al-Sunna, the one who gives victory to the Sunnah, the one who supports the Sunnah. And here he writes a kind of booklet called the Khilaf Malik, which means something like difference from Malik, going against, not going against, but holding a view that is different from that of Malik. And so great was his reverence for his teacher that according to Fakhruddin al-Razi, he actually spends a whole year praying istikhara every night before he releases this book, before he publishes it, because he thinks it could be construed as a criticism of his revered teacher. And Fakhruddin al-Razi, here as a follower of a later, more intellectualized view of things, then cites how Aristotle went against Plato. Supposedly Aristotle said, Plato is my friend, truth is my friend, and if my two friends dispute, then I will go with my friend who is called truth. That, he said, was basically Imam Shafi'i's position. Some of the Malikis were not happy, and in Egypt in particular, some Malikis were quite angry. But he also criticizes some Iraqi views as well, and also particularly the Syrians, the view of al-Awza'i. So he comes to Egypt for the last few years of his life, and here so in Egypt he engages in some quite sharp theoretical debates. The atmosphere is not particularly in favor of him. They recognize him as a great scholar, but it's prevalently a Maliki environment, and he's introducing something new in order to push his usul. And it's these rigorous debates which seem to have sharpened the dialectics of the Risala and generate what we call the second Risala, the final, as it were, authoritative, definitive version of his treatise. Now, in these debates where Imam Shafi'i was constantly caught between, on the one hand, the need to secure Muslim unity and to have courtesy, particularly with his teachers, but on the other hand, his passion for the truth and his determination that there should be an intellectually rigorous, almost philosophical method of ensuring the correct derivation of Islam from the Quran and the Sunnah. This balance that he achieved was against the background of a certain dangerous polarity or dichotomy in the society of his day, which was particularly sharp in Iraq, but was prevalent more or less everywhere, which was that there were two opposing camps, Ahl al-Hadith and Ahl al-Ra'i. The people of Hadith, those who followed the Hadith in its evident, manifest external sense, and weren't really interested in analogies, deductions, subtle linguistic comparisons of a hadith to get the true meaning of the hadith. And the Ahl al-Ra'i, which were the people who, where the hadith seemed to say different things or they're difficult to interpret, you just use what seems to be a rational, utilitarian interpretation. In his disputes with the Ahl al-Hadith, he finds that they're easy to refute. So, سَقَطُوا فِي أَيْدِيهِمْ عَاجِزِينَ مُتَحَيِّرِينَ. They were, Razi said, they were unable to deal with serious disputation. When somebody came to them with rigorous rules of logic, the Ahl al-Hadith really didn't have much to say and were generally easily defeated in the debate because they just weren't trained in those kind of rigorous, almost mathematical procedures for determining what, in this case, is the correct doctrine or the correct fiqh. This is, again, an issue that we have in our contemporary context. So many arguments amongst Muslims nowadays are based on semi-competent or incompetent individuals taking what they think to be the meaning of a single hadith and not really using any kind of general awareness of what the hadith taken as a totality might mean without having any real fiqh or deep knowledge, the wisdom of the religion which will enable them to see how the hadith should be used, because the jurists, the real fuqaha, do not follow the hadith alone, and this is an important part of the manhaj, the way of the salaf. They do not only follow the hadith. You have to have fiqh as well. So Sufyan ibn Uyayna, who's one of the great imams of the salaf, even says, and it sounds a bit edgy, al-hadithu madillatun illa lil-ulama, or illa lil-fuqaha in another riwayah. Hadith is a source of misguidance except for the jurists, except for the real scholars. Because any Tom, Dick or Harry can find a book of hadith, maybe find it even in translation, and can say, oh, this is Allah's law. But no, you have to have the fiqh, the understanding of how the law is applied, how to use a hadith, how to determine a hadith, what's abrogated, what's not abrogated, correct Arabic. If you don't have those things, then you're going to be a source of misguidance. And this is the way of the Salaf. Never interpret a hadith according to its superficial meaning unless you're really a super scholar who knows these intellectual instruments and can avoid making these errors. Ibn Wahab, again, a great student of the Malikis, used to say this: but for Malik and al-Layth, I would have been lost. I used to believe that everything related from the Prophet ﷺ must be put into practice. That was his view. If it's in a hadith, you have to follow it. That was his early understanding. And when he encountered the fuqaha, he would see that, no, there is a larger structure of fiqh which is determined by the scholars on the basis of the correct understanding of the hadith. But the hadith is not an alternative to fiqh. Imam Ahmad also used to say, it's quite characteristic of Imam Ahmad's approach, quoting from one great hadith scholar, Yahya al-Qattan, if somebody follows every rukhsa in the hadith, they become fasiq. In other words, you can be a great hadith scholar and you can find that there are hadiths which genuinely authorize some concession, some easy approach You can follow those hadiths, you're Ahl al-Hadith, but you become fasiq. You don't have the fiqh that will enable you to see where it is appropriate to use a rigorous interpretation, where it's appropriate to use the rukhsa or the concession. Imam Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, another great imam of the Salaf, used to say, when I hear a hadith, I look to see what part of it is applicable, I apply that and leave the rest. You must know the context as well. You must know what is relevant in the hadith. And that is a hugely sensitive issue and has to be done by the fuqaha. Nowadays we find people become Muslim and the next day they're holding a majlis in the mosque and they're looking at somebody's translation of Bukhari and giving fatwas, and that's just the destruction of the Sharia. And there is too much of that at the moment. This is what Imam Shafi'i is against. The manhaj of the Salaf never involves taking the literal sense of the hadith. Ibn Hibban, coming later on in the Shafi'i madhab, whoever does not have fiqh is always weak in hadith. He might have memorized 1,000,000 hadith, but if he doesn't have fiqh, he's weak. So that's the problem that the first school, the Ashab al-Hadith, have, that they think that the hadith is the fiqh. And the second school that is trying to orient himself in terms of is the Ashab al-Ra'i. These are the people who are kind of pragmatic, laid back, often judges in prosperous towns, patronized by officialdom, and they're always looking for things that are practical, that are utilitarian, that don't rock the boat, and that seem to make sense in terms of their idea of what constitutes good practice. They just use their own ijtihad, and often they don't know the hadith at all, and this is another lethal danger. In these debates, Imam Shafi'i could also defeat them because of his knowledge of the hadith, and also because of his mastery of the Arabic language. One reason why his school prevails is the beauty and the power and the precision, because Arabic can be an extraordinarily precise language. If you look at the way in which Greek philosophy was rendered really very quickly and easily into Arabic, you can see the way in which it's a vehicle for very, very precise systems of thought. And Imam Shafi'i, especially in things like his discussion of qiyas, is a master of that. So this is what we call the new school. There's the old school, al-fiqh al-qadim, and there's the new school, al-fiqh al-jadid of Imam Shafi'i, which is basically what he develops in his later stay in Iraq and in Egypt. Some would say that the Hanbalis come out of his old school. The Hanbalis are not really Ahl al-Hadith. The Hanbalis do have a fiqh, but they're not really into the very systematic, intellectualizing understanding of things like qiyas. The new school produces people like al-Bulqini and a whole range of other great scholars, possibly the best of whom, who are coming now to looking at his influence, is al-Imam al-Muzani. We should know the name of Imam al-Muzani, who is in Egypt, and sometimes is regarded, or was regarded, almost as having an independent madhab of his own. Because one of the things you see with Imam Shafi'i's followers and great students is that quite often they do go in their own direction. Ibn Jarir al-Tabari really found his own madhab, the Jariri madhab, although he comes out of Shafi'i's tradition. Ibn Khuzaymah is another person who in doctrine adopts what some would regard as an eccentric point of view, and others. So a big stable of big thinkers. Imam Muzani, the best known, the most influential, and he writes a book called the Mukhtasar. And this is the Mukhtasar of Shafi'i's larger book on law, which is called Kitab al-Umm, the book of the mother. It's like the mother of all fiqh books. And the Risala is, as it were, kind of introductory section to it. Imam Muzani writes this Mukhtasar, which makes al-Umm, which is a huge thing, kind of shorter and usable. It's an epitome. And he differs a good deal with Shafi'i, and much of the internal argument in the madhab is about questions that happen between Muzani and Shafi'i. So Ibn Surayj later on, Ibn Jurayj writes Kitab al-Taqrib bayn al-Muzani wa Shafi'i, the book of bringing together the views in which al-Muzani and al-Shafi'i differed. So Muzani is important. In Egypt, he's actually buried in the southern cemetery, al-Qarafa in Egypt, close to Imam Shafi'i himself. And it's through him that you get people like al-Tabari, Ibn Abi Hatim, and some of the great theorists of this tradition. So this is the new school, Muzani in particular, and usually when we speak of al-Madhab al-Shafi'i nowadays, we're talking about the new school. The old school, however, is incorporated in some issues. They're said classically to be 22 issues in which the Shafi'i school follows the position of Shafi'i in his old teaching rather than the new teaching. But basically it's his later Iraqi and Egyptian teaching that constitutes the Shafi'i madhab. Just to give an example, we're coming to a close inshallah, of how the Imams differ in a way that characterizes their method. The Quran says, أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ فَلَمْ تَجِدُوا مَاءً فَتَيَمَّمُوا صَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا. This is in Surah An-Nisa. It means, or when you touch women and do not find water, then use pure dust for tayammum. أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ. A classic case of how the jurists have to figure out the exact meaning of a text that seems clear but actually is open to different interpretations. And the Sahaba themselves took different views on which this meant. Shafi'i takes it pretty literally in this case. He says even an accidental touch of a man with a woman breaks his wudu. And the Malikis report the consensus of the people of Medina, which means that it is only a touch that involves pleasure that breaks the wudu. This is an example of what I mentioned earlier, the takhsis al-am, that the text seems to be am, you touch women, but the Malikis would report strong views that indicate from hadiths and so forth that this am is to be mukhassas and is to be made specific and narrow in its implication. And the Hanafis go even further and say that touching women, obviously what it means in this verse, it means sexual relations. It doesn't just mean any touch. So that's characteristic of the way in which the madhabs actually can differ quite a bit just on looking at one word, and the importance of knowing how to reach these verdicts is essential. If you leave it to anybody to just determine what la mastum means, which again often happens nowadays, unfortunately, because people just don't know the fiqh. There's been a huge focus on hadith in the Islamic world in the last 100 years and much less focus on the fiqh because it really requires brain work, which sometimes is demanding. But without the fiqh, you're just going to end up with complete chaos and wrong fatwas. Another thing that's characteristic is that he takes the position of the Salaf, which is that there can be a positive as well as a negative bid'ah. And this is the usual view in his madhab. So, for instance, the practice of building a minaret next to a mosque. There wasn't one in the time of the Sahaba. It's really constitutive of the way in which Islam works as part of the urban geography and where the muezzin goes. A mihrab in a mosque, pretty important. The way in which Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu anh put the Quran into a single mushaf, and many other things, these represent positive bid'ahs. So there can be, in the Shafi'i madhab, a bid'ah that's haram, one that's discouraged, one that's permissible, one that's recommended, one that's obligatory. And this is accepted in other madhahib as well. Many Hanafis, for instance, Ibn Abidin, will take this view, and Tahanawi also. Malikis generally, Ibn al-Hajj, in his Kitab al-Madkhal, al-Shatibi, also accepts, even though some people will say Shatibi doesn't accept the idea of bid'ah hasana, positive bid'ah, but in fact if you look at his work al-I'tisam, he says very clearly, even though he doesn't quite use that word bid'ah hasana, positive innovation, you can see that he recognizes that sometimes there is a need for something new that was not known in the early period, that is beneficial to the ummah as long as it doesn't go against something that is known to be part of the religion. Even some Hanbalis in the later period will acknowledge it, although the Hanbalis, again, don't quite use Shafi'i's term, good innovation. The final point is that the extraordinary impact of this book was facilitated by its beautiful Arabic, by its real passion for determining what is the correct sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and by its author's determination that the ummah should be united, but not by attacking one imam or another imam, but by presenting a kind of manifesto which showed that through the rigorous use of logic, you can come up with a legal philosophy in Islam. And from this time on, Islam becomes the world civilization that is ahead on jurisprudence. And so many other things help us to understand why it is that in the commentaries on the famous hadith about the mujaddids, the renewers of the ummah, the imams always indicate that Imam al-Shafi'i is the mujaddid of the second Islamic century. It's a sound hadith narrated by Imam al-Hakim in his Mustadrak. The Holy Prophet says, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Inna Allah yab'athu لهذه الأمة على رأس كل 100 سنة من يجدد لها دينها. Allah will raise up for this ummah at the beginning of every 100 years somebody who will renew for it its religion. And generally they will say Umar ibn Abdul Aziz was the mujaddid of the first century. And invariably they will say that Imam Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i is the mujaddid of the second Islamic century. And the mujaddid, Imam Suyuti has a risala on this hadith that indicates what it means. What is it to renew the ummah? It's not somebody who writes one particular tafsir or wins a battle or something like that, but somebody who renews the religion in terms of giving it once again a sense of its intention and purpose. So the ikhlas of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz and his rejection of various corrupt Arabian patronage systems in favor of the equality of believers laid down by the Holy Prophet is an example. And a Shafi'i is another good example. Somebody who explains in this kind of brilliant legal philosophy what it is that Islam is for. And Imam al-Ghazali later on, Imam al-Suyuti says everybody agrees that Imam al-Ghazali was the renewer of his century. Of course, he's coming out of Shafi'i's line, and that's not a coincidence, because he brought a renewal and a retrieval of the principle of ikhlas in every aspect of Muslim intellectual life. He is also considered by the ulama to be one of the mujaddidun, one of the mujaddids. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to send for this ummah the mujaddid of this age, because this is exactly what the Muslims need in this time. It is not through fiddling with maslahah or maqasid that the sharia once again becomes evidently to human eyes the path of ease and salvation. It is through a great thinker who has rigor and follows the azima, as well as the rukhsa, who is not just interpreting the sharia as a series of rearguard actions or concessions to the spirit of the age, but somebody who pushes for a full sunnah, which means the inward as well as the outward sunnah, which is the Ghazalian agenda, and is also the agenda of that great man of the spirit, the worshipping jurist, al-Imam Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, radiyallahu anhu wa ardah, wa akhiru da'wana anil hamdulillahi rabbil alameen. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Wal asr, innal insana lafi khusr, illa alladhina amanu wa amilus salihat, wa tawasaw bil haqq, wa tawasaw bis sabr. Sadaqallahu al-azim. Wal afwa minkum. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.